right. Good afternoon, everybody.
Hi.
All right. We're going to start momentarily and going to start with our blessing like I usually like to try to do. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. Now, I'm going to sort of start today with a quick review, a little bit, and then we'll go into some further on the particular area that we're touching on. Okay, we're looking at Sefer HaChinuch, Book of Mitzvah Education, where the author decided to write a book to explain the connection between the verses in the Torah and the various mitzvot. And what he did is he grouped them by portion of the week based on the number of mitzvot assigned to them by the Rambam in his Sefer HaMitzvot. Remember, there are all total of 613 mitzvot. Okay? So when we see a number on a paragraph, basically, this is part of that list. And we looked last week at the point that he actually started dealing with Shabbat, okay, here under the Parsha of Yitro. We see here that he cited a verse, a pasuk, as he normally does. We're calling that the foundation pasuk. In other words, it's the foundation, the place that he chose to establish the first part of his material. And we pointed out this verse from Exodus chapter 20. Okay, if you can see on the screen, I've got this part showing. Okay. And we raised the question, why did he choose this particular verse when there are at least a half a dozen other verses in the Torah that deal, many of them, by the way, referring in the book of Shmot, the book of Exodus. So why did he choose this particular verse? Exodus 20:10. You shall not do any work at all, you, your servant, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, or your cattle. And we suggested that he chose this verse because he wanted to present the lav, the negative prohibition about working on Shabbat. And it was really the only
Hello. What the heck is this?
Hello? Is there
Hi.
any, hi, is it, what happened with the class?
I don't know. It just stopped.
Oh,
Karen, do you know?
No, I don't know. Probably he's at shul. He probably got disconnected. Probably be back on. No? It looks like, why does this say end? That means I'm a host?
It says you're
Or-
the host.
Yeah, it says I'm a host. That's weird. That is weird. Hang in there. I'll call and find out.
remembering my name is Anna.
All right. I'll just keep you posted and let you know. That's the dead one right here. This is what you're seeing, right? This is a dead one.
Oh, yeah? I didn't even realize. We could drink here all the time.
Oh, okay. All right.
All right. Did you
Don't
want-
worry.
No?
Don't worry about it.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Oh, okay, so people should hang up? People should get off? Well, he can't show us how long.
We lost power, sorry.
I lost power.
Oh, here we go.
Okay, good, bye.
Back.
We're back.
Mazel tov.
Uh-huh. Okay, we're back,
Where's my picture?
right? Okay, so picking up where we roughly left off real quickly. Okay, so we see this verse is the only verse we said, particularly in Exodus, dealing with Shabbat, that gives a lav, a negative prohibition. Okay, our author then, okay, that was the verse that we see here, okay, that I'm pointing to. Now, okay. Okay, now, we saw afterwards that he decided to look at two commentaries, two Rishonim to clarify. And that's what we see now on this page. Okay. You can see that here he mentions the Rambam, and then here he mentioned the Ramban. Okay. Right in those two cases. Now, then I mentioned that he decided to try to determine between the two of them what would be the direction to go to. Because his concern was, how do you define who is responsible and how are you going to define what work is? So that's what he does in this next paragraph, okay, where he cites again a verse, but a different verse. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. So by citing this verse, okay, what he's then told us that the implication is clearly, okay, a kind of summary of the discussion in the Talmud, that the person themselves would be the one responsible. They would be subject to the death penalty. But having someone else do the work for you might result in getting what they call malkot, okay, whipping, but not the death penalty. Now, where did he derive this? He tells us here, okay, that it's from the Talmud. And so if we look at that source in the Talmud very quickly, right, we see that the discussion in the Talmud basically said, Rabbi Zabed decided this. Rabbi Chami said, if one leads a donkey loaded down with material on the Sabbath, he does not incur a guilt offering. Okay, that's if he does it unwittingly. If he does it deliberately, then he gets the death penalty, stoning. And so that implies, again, that the Talmud was used as his source to clarify, okay, who would be responsible and under what circumstances. Well, having said that, okay, we're trying to move up a little bit. Here we go. Okay, having said then who is responsible, he must then go to the second question that we raised. Not just who is responsible, but what is the prohibition of work? How do you define work? And so again, what he's done, okay, is he has pointed out here, okay, a text again from the Talmud, Eruvin, the Gemara Eruvin, which is going to define the varieties of work based on a verse. So again, he cites another verse in Exodus, and in doing so, okay, he tells us we would need to find this piece of Talmud in Eruvin. Now I'm going to share that with you because, as we said, his attempt to explain the prohibition first was dependent on who does it apply to, and secondly, what kind of work are we specifically prohibited to do? And so by citing the Mishnah, he tells us the primary labors are 40 less 1. So he's referring now to what's called the 39 melachot, or 39 av melachot, the key areas of endeavor, work, creativity, however we want to translate melacha, okay, that are defined by the rabbis, in this case in the Mishnah. I'm going to share the Mishnah with you. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves of grain, threshing, winnowing. Okay? So that's all part of the agricultural process. Next, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking. Okay? That now becomes part of the process of once you've collected the, let's say, grain, what do you have to do then to make it worth something that's edible? Okay. The next area, shearing wool, bleaching, hackling, dyeing, spinning, stretching the threads, okay, making 2 connections, weaving 2 threads, dividing threads, tying, untying, sewing stitches, tearing in order to sew. Again, all of those aspects that are expected to be done in terms of taking, let's say, the wool from the animal, converting the wool into something that can be then made into garments, and what you do with the garments. Comes a third general example: capturing a deer, slaughtering or flaying,
Yeah.
salting the deer, curing its hide, scraping it. So the capture of an animal, okay, and doing any kind of work to prepare the animal, whether it's for its meat or whether it's for using the hide of the meat. Okay, and then he continues the Mishnah, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters, building, pulling down, extinguishing, kindling. Okay? All of these are part of what we might call the building process. Okay? Either writing, building, creating something. Excuse me. And finally, striking with a hammer or carrying from one domain to another. Okay? So striking with a hammer is understood to putting any kind of finishing component on the item that you would be working on. And of course, moving from one domain to another is a transfer. So he gives us that example, okay, in particular, also taking something out from one domain to another on the Sabbath. He's now defined for us that this prohibition, based on the Torah, clarified by early authorities, based again on the Talmud, tells us who is prohibited and what kind of work is prohibited. Having done all that, right, he then wants us to understand what is the root. Okay, that's his key idea. What's the main concept? Why are we to refrain from work on Shabbat? And he tells us that we should remain away from our normal occupation in honor of the day in order to affirm our souls, our belief in the creation of the world out of non-existence, right? Which is here, as we say, okay, is an important core principle, okay, and so on. So what he's citing for us here is that the first reason that we refrain from work is to acknowledge that Hashem created the world out of nothing. And that theme of creation, that Hashem rested, implies that we must rest as well, and remember that. Okay, so the theme of creation then, and remember, if we go back and look in a Chumash, in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, right, we certainly are going to find that at the end of the creation process, Hashem sanctified the day and made it holy. And we're going to come back to that theme momentarily. Okay? So if we understand that creation, remembering creation and Hashem's saying that therefore, since he rested, we rest as a way of sanctifying the day, that is the root, the essence of why we observe Shabbat. Not only that, but that theme of creation for Shabbat serves as an important motif in our prayers for Shabbat. Let me give you a couple of examples. Okay? On Friday night, okay, what do we have towards about midway in the Kabbalat Shabbat and then the Marav, the evening service? We have the section of Vishamru, taken right from the Torah. And the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to make the Sabbath an eternal covenant for their generations. Between me and the children of Israel, it is a sign forever that in 6 days Hashem made the heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So we see that the reference to Vishamru comes back to remind us about this motif of creation as the not only the origin of Shabbat, but the reason for its becoming sanctified.
Wow,
Okay?
cool.
Not only that, but if we continue on Friday night, I'm sure we remember that 2 times in the Friday night service, we recite another paragraph from the Torah, once during the silent Amidah and once after the Amidah. That paragraph is the Vayechulu paragraph. Vayechulu hashamayim va'aretz v'chol tzva'am. Okay. The heaven and the earth were finished and all their host. On the seventh day, God completed his work, which he had done and abstained. So here again, we find biblical material, okay, referred to, and that's what he is discussing later on. So we see that creation becomes an important theme or motif as part of our observance of Shabbat, to remember the creation, but to rest because God rested and sanctified that day as a day of rest, of refraining from our normal, if you say, occupation or normal behaviors. However, our author of the Sefer HaChinuch didn't stop there. Since we know that there were other places we mentioned earlier, remember, that there were a number of places that the Torah refers to the Shabbat. Well, once, which we saw now in Breshit, book of Genesis, a number of times in Shmot, in the book of Exodus. But we also find okay, as he's going to tell us towards this end of the next paragraph, okay, in the book of Deuteronomy. So here, if we can try to okay. Here we see that he's going to cite now a verse from Deuteronomy. Okay. And so what happens? Again, he makes the reference to the Sabbath day, but he gives a different rationale. What is that? That happens to be Exodus from Egypt. And you shall remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt. Okay? Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And there's our source from Deuteronomy. So we now have two major themes, motifs, if you will, connected with Shabbat. One is creation and one is redemption. Initially, we take that as the example of the Exodus from Egypt. But Chazal, okay, wanted us to broaden that idea. And in doing so, what it wanted us to understand that is a foretaste, if I can use that word, okay, of what will eventually come about in the future redemption. When if God redeemed the Jewish people from Egypt, at some point in time in the future, he will redeem all of humanity. Okay? And so that becomes an important, the second motif. And by the way, we find that as the theme in the afternoon Mincha, Shabbat Mincha service, okay, of the Amida as well. Okay. So what we've seen so far, okay, as we begin to finish up this particular example of the mitzvah, okay, is number one, that he has cited sources from the Talmud, all right? Number two, he has chosen a number of verses, okay, from other parts of the Torah that deal with the Sabbath, but in doing so, use them to support his basic assumption that the prohibition of work on the Sabbath is a negative commandment, number one. Number two, it applies to all people, and that's what he continues to say down here towards the end of his discussion, right? It remains in force in every place and every time for both men and women, okay? Why must he say that? Because remember, we have a concept by the rabbis, okay, that if it's a mitzvah that is time-oriented, women are exempt. So here, number one, while it's time-oriented Shabbat, that only applies to a positive commandment. Here we have a negative commandment. So that limitation of time bound does not apply then to any of the observances, particularly in this case towards Shabbat. So it's both for men and for women in all places and all times. Okay? And, okay, he continues to go into some detail on this particular aspect of about a punishment. We won't go into that in detail today, okay? But I wanted us to understand that he does make a difference, a distinction, again, based on the Torah and on the writings of the rabbis, to indicate that it is significant if one breaks the law of the Shabbat on purpose versus by accident. Okay, and that's his point. Okay. I'm going to pause here for a second and ask if are there any questions on this particular example. No, it's a little bit more detailed, but it gives us a sense of how the author takes a verse from the Torah, cites it, uses it as his foundation, explains it using Talmudic and rabbinic sources, then proceeds to then apply it to appropriate manner of the laws, explaining what the root observance is, what the meaning is, and then from that, to whom does it generally apply? Okay. Any questions? Okay. All right, if not, all right, then I'm going to move us on to our new topic. Okay, and we're only going to touch it very briefly. Okay, and I want to see if I can enlarge here. There we go. Okay. Now, our next topic is marked number Kaf Yud Gimel, mitzvah number 113. Okay. It's going to come from the portion of Ki Tisa. And he cites a verse that I would think many of us are familiar with. His foundation verse. Okay, here, as I'm pointing to it, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Lo tivashel gadi b'chalev imo. Okay. Now, he's going to use that verse to indicate the mitzvah of not eating milk and meat together. Let's think of a few of the questions together that he might have to deal with. Well, question number one, from simply the verse, the pasuk itself, it says, you shall not cook, lo tivashel. If it's a prohibition of eating, why didn't he choose a verse that says you should not eat milk and meat together? Maybe there's no verse in the Torah that specifically says that to us.
Oh my goodness.
Okay. Second question we might ask. When it says you shouldn't lo tivashel, you shouldn't cook. Okay. What does he mean by cooking? Is he talking about roasting? Is he talking about boiling? Okay. What other ways, what other means are there, okay, to produce food besides cooking? When we say cooking, roasting, boiling, right? Okay. And so the third question we're going to deal with that he has to, address. If, let's say, the verse clearly spells out that by cooking, okay, it means you cannot take these items and cook them together. Okay? Is that only a prohibition of consumption, of eating it? Or is it a prohibition also of deriving any benefit from it? For example, fine, I might understand the verse to say, I can't cook these two items together. Okay, but let's say I've got a dog and I have meat from dog food, or I give him, okay, some leftover hamburger. Could I pour milk into the bowl that has that hamburger meat or that dog food
No,
and give it to my dog?
no,
I'm not necessarily cooking it.
no, she can't.
Okay?
You're benefiting from it.
But I think that was Jeffrey, right, Jeffrey?
Yeah,
Okay, so Jeffrey says, hold on. You're still benefiting from it because your dog, okay, seems to
your dog.
enjoy it.
Yeah.
Okay? And so so we can see that by choosing a particular verse for the foundation, our author, okay, is going to have a number of items to deal with. A definition of cooking, number one. Number two, okay, a definition of, is it only the prohibition of consumption? Okay, what about a prohibition of benefit? Okay, and we said, in addition to that, okay, what other aspects he would have to deal with. Okay? So as we begin to finish up today, right, I want to point out just that he addresses those kinds of normal questions by telling us almost immediately. Okay? And this verse comes to forbid eating or deriving benefit from meat and milk. So he's already told us, okay, that is the case. Okay? But as we raise the question, why didn't he cite a verse that specifically says you should not eat milk and meat, or you cannot have benefit from milk and meat? And so he's going to have to give us a somewhat lengthy discussion, primarily based on, again, the Talmud, right? As to on what basis do we say that benefit is forbidden as well as consumption? And number two, okay, why did he use this verse? And how do we understand this verse as the foundation verse for the prohibition of milk and meat? By the way, I'll just finish up by reminding everyone that this verse, while he cites it here in Exodus, is actually recited 3 times in the Torah. And that might lead to another question. Why did it have to be repeated? Wouldn't have once have been enough? We're going to stop there. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank
And
you.
we look forward, hopefully, to being together again next week.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, very good. Okay, problem is I don't.